You won't need stars tonight. Just the slow rise of smoke, the hush between two drum beats, and the quiet shimmer of obsidian catching moonlight dot. This is Tenochtitlan, but not the one from textbooks. This one breathes. It hums beneath your ribs. It waits. Somewhere deep inside Templo Mayor, a priest fastens a feathered mask without a sound. His shadow stretches across stone, worn smooth by centuries of bare feet and ash. Behind him, the Tlahuilli drum is waking, its rhythm like a heart. Remembering something older than time, copal curls into the air, thick and sweet, like memory melting. The moon above isn't just watching, it's listening. Listening to obsidian sing, to silence tighten, to an entire city hold its breath under feathers and silver. Tonight, you don't have to understand the language. Just let the rhythm hold. You, let the smoke carry your thoughts. This isn't a history lesson, it's a slow descent into myth dot, so dim your lights. Let the walls around you soften, and if the shadows in the corner begin to flicker like torchlight, don't worry, that's just the ritual unfolding. If this kind of quiet journey helps you rest, feel free to subscribe or share the time and place you're listening from. Maybe the next stream will pass over your sky to now. The drum begins. Just once. And we begin with an asterisk. You might not expect a drum made of hollowed cedar, stretched with deer hide and given the charming name Tlahuilli, little light giver, to create a bass throb so soft that it seems to pat the air rather than strike it. Yet here we are, listening to just such a sound seeping through the moonlit courtyard of Templo Mayor. The drum beat moves like a sleepy heartbeat boom. 2 heartbeats later, boom leaving long stretches of silence in which silver shadows rearrange themselves along the temple's basalt stairs. A bored, barefoot acolyte tries to match his breathing to the rhythm, inhales too soon, and almost hiccups. Somewhere, a novice scribe records that hiccup on a bark paper slip, because the Mexica were nothing if not thorough. That very slip, folded and forgotten, will fall from an archaeologist's trowel 6 centuries later, startling a field mouse. Tiny absurdities travel farther than obsidian blades. Asterisk, the drumbeat coaxes the first scene into focus, a single torch. Guttering in the night breeze, sap resins popping like rice kernels. The torch sits inside a clay dish whose maker inscribed a sleepy joke along the rim, something about May's god bedtime, but the letters are so small that even deities would squint. A tuft of rabbit fur, tied for luck, flutters on the torch. Handle. No one remembers why rabbit fur equals luck. Perhaps rabbits simply look perpetually surprised, like anyone awake after midnight. Above, the moon hangs huge and a little dented, like a dropped tortilla rescued from the griddle. Every now and then, its light glints on the polished obsidian chips embedded in the courtyard floor, creating the illusion of puddles that will never wet your sandals. The drum slows again, boom. 4 heartbeats this time, encouraging anyone within earshot to count grains of volcanic sand until their thoughts melt away like cacao in warm milk. A shiver of movement shifts us into the second scene without fuss. The feathered masked priest, more plumage than person, steps forward, obsidian blade held sideways so it gleams only for the moon. His mask is layered quetzal tail, macaw red, and one small cluster of hummingbirds shimmer near the left cheek. The right cheek fell silent last year when a moth nibbled it. He raises the blade, not to threaten, but to let moonlight trace its edge, a practice step like a dancer marking beats he could never forget. A sigh passes through the watching apprentices, partly reverence, partly the collective relief that nobody is expected to clap. In the hush, our micro hook drifts by. The priest's sandals, stitched from agave fibers, squeak faintly, no grand squeal, just the soft complaint of a floorboard in sandal form. Historians later argue whether the squeak signified humility or merely damp weather. Footnotes multiply. Readers doze off midway through Appendix B. The priest begins a simple recitation, 9 words in classical Nahuatl, each separated by the hush of the courtyard. Scholars translate them in conflicting ways, ranging from moon, lend us your cool silence, to please keep the merchants quiet until dawn. Personally, I lean toward the second. A silent marketplace sounds like the greatest miracle of all. He repeats the verse until the words stop being words and become gentle taps against the inside of one's skull. Tapping, tapping, like a patient woodpecker refusing to wake the tree. A novice nearby blinks slowly, tries to remember if he blew out the kitchen hearth, then decides fire is tomorrow's problem. The obsidian blade points skyward, catching a single thread of cloud that drifts by like lint wandering between universes. Now the third scene drifts in, borne on a ribbon of copal smoke curling from pots at the pyramid's base. Copal smells of citrus rind left out in the sun, of pine sap, of lost report cards accidentally burned. The smoke rises in twisting columns, hesitates halfway, then spreads into a gauzy ceiling that even the moon respects. Under this aromatic tint, the moonlight proceeds at a tempo so languid it could be mistaken for stillness. A second acolyte walks in counter-tempo, sprinkling sunflower petals one at a time, a task so soothing he once fell asleep mid-sprinkle. Petals clinging to his tunic like quiet confetti. The micro-hucks flutter past, a beetle that mistakes a petal for a fairy, a spectator counting his own yawns. The odd fact that copal, when traded north, became a fashionable moth repellent long before cupboards existed. The priest lowers the blade to reflect moonlight toward the smoke, creating a trembling silver stripe that dances on the perfumed haze. According to temple rumor, if you stare at that stripe long enough, you catch a glimpse of your own future doing absolutely nothing of consequence. An image so relaxing that you might finally forgive yourself for unfinished checklists. Somewhere, in the audience, a merchant covertly tests the rumor, sees himself napping behind a stall of gourds, and smiles so widely that his face lapses into a yawn. A soft breeze tries to carry the smoke away, fails, and settles for combing the feathers. On the priest's mask instead, the breeze would shrug if breezes had shoulders. Gradually, like dawn rehearsal arriving ahead of schedule, the final scene unfolds. The drum is silent now, the copal nearly gone, and the sky grows the faintest hint of turquoise at the edges. A forest of quetzal feathers attached to banners, helmets, and one overly ambitious lapdog cloak begins to catch those subtle colors, turning emerald tips to gold and sapphire sheens to pale pink. A rooster's call echoes from the distant chinampas, not the barnyard clatter of later centuries, but a throatier, forest cousin cry, as if announcing the return of light is a job it takes seriously for about 3 minutes each day. The priest, ceremony complete, lifts his mask for the first time. His eyes look pleasantly unfocused, the gaze of someone listening to a story too soothing to end. Stone steps begin to absorb warmth, and obsidian floor chips lose their watery trick, becoming dull pebbles again. A scribe unfurls a fresh strip of amatl paper, copies the 9 spoken words, then adds a note about the beetle fairy because trivia tides always reach the margins. He stifles a laugh at his own footnote, a laugh so gentle that it jostles nothing but a single sunflower petal. Still stuck to his hair, in a nearby brazier, a last coal glows, sighs, and turns to gray lace, the most delicate textile nobody will ever wear. For a moment, all sounds align: the distant rooster, the quiet broom of a servant brushing petals, the hush of sandals being reclaimed from dust, and together they hum like a lullaby disguised as a census. As dawn's palette brightens, the courtyard releases its audience and drifts. They leave as slowly as water soaking into porous stone, taking with them the smell of copal and the lingering taste of moonlit quiet. Somewhere beyond the temple walls, cacao froths in clay cups, waiting to be sipped by priests who will promptly forget whether they added chili this time. The merchant yawns again, already halfway to the dream of his gourd stall. The novice remembers. The hearth at last decides embers can fend for themselves, and follows the others, trailing one final petal that sticks to his heel. Quetzal feathers fold, drums rest, and the moon relinquishes its silver to the sun without quarrel, leaving only a thought as soft as corn dough. That's sometimes the grandest. Ceremonies are merely elaborate excuses for everyone to stand together. In the dark, breathe slowly, and listen for sleep to arrive on feathered wings. You might not think that a single perforated sheet of pale blue paper, smaller than a handkerchief and priced at exactly 1 penny, could lull half a nation into quieter correspondence. Yet here we are, listening to its faint rustle across. A very long Victorian night. If you discover that you're somehow still awake once we reach the riveting subject of adhesive gum quality, feel free to subscribe or simply lean back and let the postal rates finish tucking you in. The Royal Mail has never hurried anyone to bed, and I won't start now. The scene drifts open in 1840, when Sir Rowland Hill, a man whose notebooks were allegedly ruled more neatly than his front lawn, proposes that letters should cost the same no matter how far they travel. Before him, postage was calculated by the mile, the mood, and occasionally the weather. Some carriers claimed fog counted as extra distance because it felt longer. Hill's reform reads like a bedtime mantra, 1 penny for all so simple that Parliament initially suspects it of hiding mischief, the way a cat hides a nap behind half-closed eyes. Printers across London begin experimenting with the first prepaid envelopes, choosing a soothing tint called Queen's Blue, though its precise recipe varies with each ink batch, producing envelopes that range from moonlit slate to the color of skimmed milk left outside. Collectors will one day argue about tiny shade differences, pausing only to make more tea. Somewhere among them, a clerk files the first officially dull complaint. He dislikes how the glue tastes vaguely of pickled turnip. The note survives, of course, because the post system keeps everything, like a grandmother's attic that spares no button dot as the penny post settles into routine, an unexpected outcome emerges. People write more slowly, without mileage fees nibbling. At their thoughts, they stretch their sentences the way a cat stretches paws, adding harmless flourishes, "Madam, I remain," that say nothing yet soothe the ego. A micro hook flutters by. One Birmingham ironmonger spends 42 words, avoiding the admission that his shipment of screws is late by a fortnight. Historians later count those words and realize that the additional ink cost outweighed the saved postage. Far from fretting, the ironmonger celebrates with a second cup of chicory coffee, modern caffeine before coffee became fashionable. Meanwhile, rural postmen acquire new bags 2 inches larger than before, leading one village poet to dub them marsupial clerks. The nickname sticks for precisely 3 months, until someone points out that marsupials can nap standing up. While postmen may not, we drift gently into the middle decades, when London's red pillar boxes appear like polite mushrooms at street corners. Each bears the royal cipher, yet the real novelty is the tiny slip wide enough for a folded friendship, narrow enough to discourage jam tarts. Passers-by experiment with wind angles, discovering that letters drop too quickly sometimes, flutter back out like startled pigeons. An enterprising child in Bloomsbury times this rebound and earns tuppence returning escaped envelopes to embarrassed senders. Technically a public service, practically a bedtime fable about gravity. The postal authorities respond by tilting the internal shelf 1 degree steeper, a modification so minute that only one engineer cares. He records the adjustment on a lemon-colored form, files it under miscellaneous slope improvements, and sleeps soundly. His descendants will one day find the form and wonder whether to frame it or recycle it. Naturally, they compromise. By misplacing it by the 1870s, postcards arrive half a penny each, front bare for address, back begging for brevity. Their very cheapness feels like a lullaby. People begin jotting messages shorter than their own signatures, such as arrive, weather tolerable, send socks. Privacy critics claim the open format will ruin polite society, yet society merely yawns and continues, slightly relieved to skip formal salutations. One Brighton fishmonger uses a postcard to record the exact temperature at which his haddock glaze congeals. He mails the card to himself, perhaps seeking a witness to the miracle. Later, librarians will catalog thousands of such self-addressed notes bearing drizzle reports, cat weights, and the occasional cryptic line. Remember the umbrella that isn't. None solve any mystery. All soothed by existing. The halfpenny postcard triggers a subtler change. The post office issues timetable posters so unreadably detailed that even accountants nod off halfway through column 6. These posters list collection times down to the quarter hour, yet observers notice that postmen rarely match the precision. One excuses himself by claiming pigeons reset the village clock tower. Rather than punish him, superiors praise the creativity and print a pamphlet on bird-induced delays. The pamphlet earns a footnote in the annual report, which itself doubles as a doorstop in quieter branches. In a sleepy corner of Dorset, an elderly postmistress skims the report each winter, searching for her own name even though she has never left her station. Finding nothing, she smiles, knits another red mitten, and feels inexplicably seen. Night mail trains loaded with canvas sacks adds another layer of gentle monotony. Engineers experiment with sea green carriage lamps thought to calm both passenger and parcel. No study confirms this, but the hue becomes tradition. Inside, clerks sort letters by the sway of the rails, a rhythm like rocking chair wheels on old floorboards. One clerk claims he can feel the London to Edinburgh gradient in his wrists. Another simply hums lullabies. Micro hook during particularly foggy nights, the engine whistle resembles a sleepy whale calling from beyond the moors. A poet later publishes this observation in a journal nobody buys, thereby achieving the purest form of publication words instantly at rest. Toward the century's end, the post office introduces pneumatic tubes beneath parts of London, whooshing telegrams in metal capsules like marbles through invisible corridors. Spectators gather to hear the faint thud of delivery, described by newspapers as a courteous cough beneath the floorboards. The system never becomes widespread, partly because engineers argue whether the whoosh is soothing or alarming. Trials continue at twilight when commuters hurry home. Few notice the hissing valves beneath their feet, though one terrier pauses every evening to cock its head at the sound, falling briefly into canine contemplation. The tubes eventually close for budget reasons. The capsules are repurposed as pencil holders. Quietly retiring from Velocity Dot by 1902, Sunday collections are debated in Parliament, arousing almost enough interest to interrupt tea time. Arguments focus on whether forced Sabbath repose might actually accelerate Monday's mail by discouraging frivolous weekend notes about gooseberry pie. A statistician produces a table showing gooseberry mentions peak on Fridays, but the table is printed so small that only he can read it. Others take his word, yawn, and move on to buttered scones. The motion fails, reinstated, and fails again, leaving the schedule exactly as it was, proving that change can be as circular as a postmark. Somewhere in the archives, all drafts of the debate slumber in adjacent folders, alphabetical neighbors destined never to converse, and so the penny post evolves into a lattice of predictable comforts. The post horn emblem embossed on waistcoat, Buttons, the steady clop of delivery carts that horses memorize so well they could navigate while thinking about oats. The habit of slipping a letter under the kettle lid to steam the seal loose for rereading, and the quietly thrilling realization that reply might arrive in only 2 days instead of 4. Each adjustment, tiny in isolation, layers into a softness that blankets the century, encouraging people to measure time not in minutes, but in expected paper arrivals. When nothing arrives, they shrug and add an extra lump of sugar to their tea, confident that tomorrow's clatter of hooves will compensate Dot as our own night lengthens. Imagine a single Victorian sitting room with the fire reduced to polite embers. On the side table rests a letter just opened, its edges still warm from pocket heat. The wax seal lies beside it like a miniature moon shrugged off its orbit. No urgency pushes the reader to answer. Postage costs no more today or tomorrow. He folds the sheet once, twice, exactly along the watermark, tucks it back into its envelope, and sets it beneath a ceramic spaniel for safekeeping. The spaniel, chipped ear notwithstanding, has guarded dozens of similar envelopes, each containing news so mild it could rock itself to sleep. Outside, the night mail train exhales over distant tracks, and the lamplighter extinguishes one more street flame with a snuffer shaped like a tulip. The sky, assured that correspondence is accounted for, dims a final shade. Somewhere in a locked drawer of an obsolete sorting office, an undelivered postcard still waits. Its message consists of 5 words, arriving Tuesday. Bring the biscuits. The addressee long ago forgot which biscuits were intended, yet the sentiment drifts on, preserved by the very delay that prevented its arrival. Perhaps that is the secret lullaby of the postal reforms, the knowledge that even the letters which never reach us are resting comfortably somewhere, catalogued in pencil, awaiting a reader who will greet them with the gentlest possible nod before shelving them back into the endless, soothing quiet of the archive. You may find it odd that the width of a wooden bench, precisely 4 feet and 7 1/4 inches, if anyone was still tallying, could inspire 5 separate committees and an entire century's worth of pencil shavings, yet here we sit, letting that measurement rock us gently toward dreamland. If you're somehow alert by the time we glide past the riveting debate over varnish gloss, you may, in your own unhurried fashion, tap the subscribe button. Though I'd be just as pleased if you're already asleep, drooling comfortably on an armrest that meets no standard at all. Our drowsy journey begins beside a mist-veiled rural platform in 1889, when the newly nationalized railways of Prussia notice an inconvenient truth. Benches ordered from Berlin arrive a little longer than those delivered from Cologne, leaving travelers to perform a mild waltz whenever one seat jets proud of its neighbor. An inspector armed with a brass caliper records every discrepancy, his notebook filling with numbers so similar they blur, like sheep counting themselves. He writes, "Variance half thumb. Unremarkable. Nothing is done, yet inaction itself becomes the first lull of policy, a soft promise that change will approach at a pace fit for yawns." Somewhere down the track, a Bavarian station master pats the short bench legs with folded timetables. Patrons wonder why the schedule feels sturdier than the seat. By 1903, a second scene drifts in, carrying warmer lamps and the faint scent of coal dust. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, fond of symmetry in uniforms, if nowhere else, circulates a memorandum titled Sitzbank-Einheit, or Bench Unity. Its main clause stipulates a width generous enough for 3 adults wearing winter coats and 1 child. Holding a wax paper pastry, engineers immediately argue over pastry diameter. One suggests a standard cinnamon roll for measurement. Another counters with a poppy seed braid of variable girth. The dispute lasts 15 minutes, then wanders off for coffee, never to return. Micro Hook, a clerk tasked with translating the memo into Slovene, renders bench unity as Sadalma. Harmonija, accidentally sparking a local chorale society that meets on Tuesdays to sing about furniture. They still rehearse 2 centuries later, though half the members are uncertain why. As night settles across the continent, the Great Bench Conference of 1911 convenes in Basel, chosen because its hotel carpets already feature restful stripes the color of decaf cocoa. Delegates arrive clutching measuring tapes like fretful tailors. Someone proposes adopting the Swiss post and rail design oak slats, iron supports, 5-degree backrest angle, arguing it encouraged both upright posture and philosophical. Resignation during delays. A rival faction praises the French model, which slopes slightly forward, nudging occupants to vacate swiftly when the train steams in. After 3 days of polite contention, the committee votes to continue studying the matter. Minutes record the decision in 4 languages, each using a different synonym for postpone. Copies of these multilingual minutes later cushion a wobbly leg on the very table where they were written. Thus, paperwork finds meaningful purpose. Third scene. The interwar years shimmer like a lantern viewed through half-closed lids. Resources grow scarce, encouraging rail companies to refurbish older benches rather than purchase new. This yields the phenomena of patchwork seating, where mahogany slats are bolted beside pine, giving travelers a subliminal lesson in dendrology. A micro hook wanders by on a foggy Tuesday in 1928. A passenger counts 93. Distinct wood grains between Frankfurt and Mainz, falls happily asleep at 87 and misses his stop. In the lost property log, he blames mesmerizing arboreal diversity. Administrators, unsure whether that's an item or a complaint, file the note under misc. Meanwhile, chemists experiment with shellac mixtures, producing a finish that glows faintly under gaslight. One magazine lauds it as moonbeam polish. Another calls it slippery when sight upon. Both reviews appear on the same page, separated by an advertisement for travel blankets that never itch. Sales remain modest but steady, much like the mood. Yet even the gentlest bureaucracy accumulates bulk. By 1950, the International Union of Railways releases its long-awaited Code 243, passenger seating fixtures. It specifies not only length and height, but the exact radius of each rounded corner, lest a dozing elbow meet anything sharper than a baby's dream. Reading the code feels like sliding into cool water, line after line of negligible but oddly comforting instruction, from screw head types domed, not flat, to permissible squeak decibel levels, 11 at most, measured before dawn. In Section 5, a note clarifies that color should blend discreetly with soot residue. Paint vendors propose coal-kissed beige. No one buys it, yet the phrase becomes a lullaby in design schools, whispered just before exams. Our final tableau unfolds in the electrified 1970s, when plastic composites tempt engineers with bold possibilities. Prototype benches in snowy Finland feature fiberglass ribs resembling whale skeletons. Passengers politely refuse to sit, fearing they'll tip backwards into chilly efficiency. Back in gentler Austria, a carpenter named Frau Hannelore crafts replacement slats from beechwood salvaged after a mild flood. Her handiwork carries faint watermarks, recalling river lullabies that rock commuters through early morning commutes. A micro-hut pauses. One retiree spends his weekends oiling Hannelore's benches with linseed, convinced that the scent keeps pigeons from philosophical despair. Researchers test this hypothesis, find no effect, but doze peacefully beside the cages and declare the experiment inconclusive yet restorative. Through it all, letters continue to circulate requesting adjustments. Move a bench 3 inches left to align with a new timetable board. Shorten one end to fit a kiosk that never materializes. Replace slats varnished too lustrously, for they reflect sunset into an inspector's eyes. Each missive enters the archive, and the archive, like a contented cat, curls deeper into its own paper warmth. Somewhere within, the earliest complaint about turnip-flavored glue, remember part 2, nods companionably to a more recent remark, bench varnish smells faintly of dough. The archive does not judge scent or syntax. It merely settles heavier into silence. Tonight, as your own train platform fades behind closed eyelids, picture a single standardized bench waiting beneath an electric lamp that hums like a distant hive. Rain taps the slats in metronomic approval. A timetable flutters on the wall, its corners rounded to the approved radius. No train is late because lateness itself has dozed off. You lower yourself onto the wood, feeling each measurement cradle. You 4 feet, 7 1/4 inches from armrest to armrest. Seat height exactly 17. Backrest angle just so. These numbers, debated by generations, now exist only to hold you still. The lamp shifts from yellow to softer yellow. A timetable page turns because some faint draft remembers the days of steam. Stations farther down the line dim their signals in quiet sympathy. Somewhere, a clerk oils a hinge that was never truly squeaky, for the gentle act of almost maintenance reassures both hinge and clerk alike. You may dream of trains gliding past invisible corners, each carriage carrying the scent of shellac, coal-kissed beige, and perhaps a whisper of linseed. Benches inside the compartments match those on every platform because Code 243 insists on harmony even in motion. Passengers drift between waking and sleep, lulled by the surety that wherever they disembark, the bench awaiting them will feel exactly blissfully familiar. At that moment, the world shrinks to the comfort of knowing that someone, long ago, decided a handspan and a half was the perfect allotment for a waiting soul, and committees across decades agreed, one softly rounded corner at a time. You might not expect the thickness of a beeswax wick, weighed in grains instead of grams, to dictate the bedtime fortunes of half a dozen medieval parishes. But here we are, tracing its lazy spiral through history as though it were the warm smoke of a guttering taper. If by some miracle you're still awake once we reach the riveting statute on drip tray diameter, feel free to subscribe or simply exhale into your pillow and let the wax harden undisturbed. It begins. Softly enough in the year 1347 when the sleepy hill town of Lesser Roodbury decides to tax candles after sunset. Daylight, they reason, remains God's free gift, but night must be rented in tiny glowing increments. The aldermen meet in a hall that smells of damp wool and faint honey. They hammer out 1 farthing per tallow inch, halfpenny for wax. Nobody owns a ruler precise enough for the job, so the clerk, who prefers knitting to numeracy, wraps a yarn strand around each candle, then measures yarn against his thumb. Thus the thumb's width tariff is born, a fiscal policy entirely dependent on whether the clerk has recently trimmed his nails. Records note mild revenue hiccups whenever he takes up carpentry and files them short. In the ledger margin, someone doodles a smiling sun wearing spectacles. Perhaps even the daylight pondered a surcharge. The ordnance drifts beyond Roodbury like the smell of rendered fat, wafting down trade routes toward larger market towns. There, in our second drowsy scene, professional gaugers appear, brandishing calipers carved from applewood. They form the brotherhood of measured luminescence, though locals sensibly call them the candle counters. Each brother carries a small iron seal depicting a moth in mid-flutter. After coins clink into his purse, he presses this seal into the fresh wax of the merchant's sample candle, leaving a neat crater where a flame will never burn. A curious micro-hook flits past. One junior brother, misunderstanding instructions, stamps his own thumbprint instead of the moth crest for 6 whole months. When the oversight is discovered, merchants protest that thumb-marked candles burn calmer on windy altars. The council commissions a scientific trial involving 12 novice monks, 3 drafty cloisters, and a basket of unconvincing moths. Results remain inconclusive but pleasantly aromatic. Years slide by like melted wax along brass, and soon we glide into scene 3, the late 15th century boom of decorative drip pans. Nobles fear furnace soot on embroidered table runners, so artisans hammer pewter saucers with shallow ridges meant to catch each golden bead before it stains the cloth. Fashionable hostesses compare rich counts. 7 is tasteful restraint, 9 slightly ostentatious, 11 a sure sign one's tapestry fortune has come from loan interest rather than land. In the hush of a banquet, guests can tell whether they've been seated according to favor, simply by counting the tiny gutters circling their assigned candlestick. One court poet writes a sonnet likening social hierarchy to the wax that never ventures past the 8th ring, though he wisely tucks it into a drawer. For those of us drifting toward sleep, the image of plates within plates feels like nested Z's, each ridge a cozy barrier against spillage of thought. Meanwhile, the candle counters update their regulations. New scrolls specify wick fiber twists 45 turns per cubit of flax to ensure equitable flame longevity. Farther down, Clause 7 politely forbids braiding stray cat hair into wicks, save in dire scarcity, a line added. After one collector's unfortunate sneeze extinguishes an entire chapel vigil. There's also an addendum on scented additives of excessive pungency, targeting adventurous chandlers who mix rosemary, myrrh, and something politely called foreign lemon, causing friars to daydream of orchards mid-psalm. The penalty involves kneeling in a cool crypt until one attains nose blindness, an unexpectedly restful form of correction. By our 4th and final tableau, we find ourselves amid Reformation austerity. Candle taxes plummet when simpler churches embrace plain tallow stubs, their smoky halos considered humble and appropriately brief. The Brotherhood, threatened with redundancy, petitions to measure sermon length instead, arguing they know much about burn time and could surely estimate homiletic glow. The idea flickers, dims, and is snuffed. Some counters retire to quiet villages, where they continue stamping mauve cress onto their own hearth candles out of habit. One such retiree, old brother Oswin, invents the night half measure, slicing each taper at a slanted angle so evening feels shorter and morning closer. Neighbors adopt the practice, and soon an entire hamlet greets dawn 30 minutes early, claiming it improves rooster punctuality. Historians later dub this phenomenon the Oswin slant, though few bother to verify the angle. It sounds about right. And that's restful enough. At century's end, the thumb's width tariff survives only in archival dust, but its quiet legacy lingers whenever you, half asleep, tilt a candle just so to drip wax onto letter or cake. Suppose before the flame gutters out, you notice a shallow crater, the ghost of a moth's wing, or perhaps merely the dent of someone's long forgotten thumb. Either impression whispers of coins collected, benches warmed in counting holes, and regulations precise enough to be meaningless. The world outside your room still revolves, yet here within, light has been weighed, taxed, stamped, and finally spent, all for the gentle luxury of these closing breaths. So ease back. Let each cooling drip form another infinitesimal ridge against wakefulness, and listen for the flicker's last sigh. The tariff has long expired, the gauger's seal grown cold, and even Brother Oswin's slanted stub has met its own white ash. What remains is the sweet smell of beeswax uncharged, unmeasured, and yours alone settling over the dark like a blanket that knows exactly when to let go. You may not think a single strip of iron, curled snug around a wooden ale barrel, could inspire 22 years of paperwork, but that is the gentle whirlpool we slip into tonight. If by some heroic quirk you remain awake once we reach the riveting footnote on hoop-keeper apprentices, feel free to tap the faintest like or subscribe, though truly, Blinking twice in slow approval will do dot. Our quiet chronicle begins in 1721, when the county of Shropshire discovers that barrels, arriving from neighboring Staffordshire, no longer fit the town's weighing cradles. The discrepancy, traced to hoops hammered just one thumb breadth wider, causes grain inspectors to lean sideways, squinting at tilted scales that insist 2 stone of barley has become 2 stone, and a philosophical shrug. Merchants grumble, scribes record. Ale continues to froth, oblivious. Somewhere in the margin of the first complaint letter, a clerk sketches a beer mug wearing a halo labeled margin of error. It is the document's most persuasive argument. Parliament, ever fond of subjects unlikely to revolt, convenes a select committee on cooperage uniformity. Their sessions smell of parchment and last night's porter. Witnesses produce sample hoops like shy bracelets, each claiming, with modest pride, to represent the one true circumference. A blacksmith named Mildred Finch presents a hoop forged on a misty equinox. She swears its diameter aligns with cosmic harmony and the average waistline of St. Cuthbert, though nobody is certain what that measures in inches. Across the hall, her rival brandishes a thinner band for lighter taxes, prompting a micro hook. An MP asks whether lighter taxes might also be applied to parliamentary speeches. The jest hovers, unrecorded, like steam over a kettle. Outside the chamber, alehouse discourse ferments faster than policy. Patrons invent barrel riddles. When is a hoop not a circle? Answer: when a tacksman measures it. Local bards compose odes to the noble elliptical keg, recited between yawns. One afternoon, a cooper demonstrates hoop stress by rolling casks downhill. Half burst open, releasing middling ale that forms a brief, foamy creek. Children float twigs upon it, dubbing them HMS regulation. Within minutes, every twig has run aground on thirsty soil, an unintentionally perfect metaphor that even the children seem too drowsy to notice. By 1729, the committee issues its first draft. Hoops shall be, neither exceeding nor receding 1 barley corn's breadth from the standard of 7 inches and 1/2. A helpful footnote defines barley corn as the middle grain plucked from the middle ear of the middle stalk, a specification that requires 3 farmers, 2 mirrors, and deep agricultural patience. Inspectors soon discover each middle. Grain differs by the subtlest whisper, so they average 3 grains and divide by the angle of the sundial. The resulting arithmetic lulls everyone involved into a peaceful near slumber. Meanwhile, smaller towns adopt inventive workarounds. Ludlow millers drill crescent-shaped notches into cradles, claiming the curve accommodates spiritual expansion of wood on humid saints' days. Oswestry taverns simply prop 1 barrel end with a folded hymn sheet quietly rehearsing a merger of sacred and suds. The county bishop investigates, samples the ale for evidence, and concludes, after 3 pints, that ecclesiastical intervention is unnecessary if everyone just breathes slowly. His official seal appears on the report, a mitre flanked by 2 extremely contented barrels. Back in Parliament, the debate drifts into an eddy over hoop material. Should barrel iron be sourced from domestic ore, or allowed to wander in from Swedish mines rumored to produce hoops so obedient they almost tighten themselves? One gentleman fears foreign hoops may promote moral laxity if metal can adjust. Why not ethics? Another counters that Swedish iron sings when struck, a pleasant ring. That could serve as village curfew. A third wonders aloud whether hoops might be yarn-wrapped to prevent winter tongue frost, recalling a childhood mishap involving a cold lamppost. The clerk records only general musings on metallurgical propriety unresolved. A sleepy. Year later, the Hoop Act passes its 2nd reading, now stipulating an official stamp of circular virtue, a tiny crown impressed at due north on each band. Inspectors carry miniature compasses to verify orientation. Naturally, northern cooperages produce hoops with crowns at due south, arguing relativity. The argument meanders into philosophical territory. If a barrel rolls, does the crown remain? North, or does North merely chase it? Minutes preserve 11 pages of cordial puzzlement before everyone settles on tea and a short recess that lasts the entire winter. By scene 3. About 14 years into our gentle saga, the country boasts more inspectors than coopers. Some set up roadside weighing kiosks, coaxing weary cart drivers to pause for a quick circumference check. Drivers offer snoring oxen as collateral while they nap in wagon shadows. One inspector, fond of poetry, leaves haiku receipts. Hoop. Meat standard, ale safe in stave's embrace, coins jingle softly. We treasure the thought of crumpled haiku drifting in barn lofts, perfuming hay with fate ink and bureaucratic tranquility. The final push toward law occurs in 1743, propelled by a surplus of unused red sealing wax ordered for an unrelated cider. Decree. No official wishes to waste supplies, so the Hoop Act becomes an ideal wax consumer. Seals bloom on documents like sleepy red poppies. The air in committee rooms smells of warm resin and contentment. On the 5th of June, the act receives royal assent during a mild drizzle that muffles ceremonial fanfare into near silence. One witness reports the king's signature looked decidedly relaxed. Implementation, however, proves anticlimactic. Barrel hoops already forged fail to obey retroactively, so thousands receive post-dated absolutions stamped "forgiven" by circumstance. Cooperages host small forgiveness feasts, clinking plates atop barrels of every diameter. They serve lukewarm broth and bread, foods that politely request neither cutlery nor conversation. The Brotherhood of Measured Luminescence, recently unemployed from candle duty, reemerges, offering to double-check hoop crowns for a modest fee. Towns accept mostly out of nostalgia, enjoying the mellow tap-tap of their stamps echoing through storehouses at dusk dot in the soft afterglow of legislation. Commerce ambles on. A ledger from 1747 reveals only 2 prosecutions, one hoop crowned at due west, the other at due everything, its iron rim beaten into a wavering star. Fines are paid in jars of pickled apples, promptly shared among clerks. A marginal note observes that pickled apple scent mingling with ink induces a most agreeable yawn. We can attest to that. The mere idea feels like a cushioned dot. Eventually, the standard of 7 inches and 1/2 fades from memory, crowded out by shinier obsessions, steam valves, postage rates, the precise length of piano wire. Yet in dusty lofts across Shropshire, you may still find a crown-marked hoop propping open a window, keeping spring breezes honest. On damp nights it rings faintly, like distant church bells practicing scales. Some swear the tone is perfect G-sharp, others that it's simply the iron complaining of old mathematical ghosts. Either way, its quiet music reminds us that even the humblest circle can once have held parliaments undivided. Languid gaze dot, so as your thoughts settle like sediment at the bottom of a well-coopered cask, let hoops and crowns drift into overlapping rings behind your eyelids. Imagine inspectors closing their ledger, leaving a single candle-stamped moth, of course burning on the sill. The flame shrinks, the crown stamp glimmers, and Shropshire slips into darkness, confident that every barrel, whether compliant or charmingly askew, will still pour ale enough for tomorrow's drowsy toast. You may not expect the humble brass token that once dangled from a schnauzer's collar to have funded half a mile of cobblestone, but here we are. If you manage to remain awake long enough to hear about the 1792 incident of counterfeit dachshund tags, feel free to subscribe or simply sigh contentedly. Either gesture counts as engagement in my ledger. Our quiet ramble drifts first to the mist-draped valleys of the Principality of Hohenlohe-Langenburg, where, in the spring of 1784, the Council of Very Minor Necessities declared that every dog, regardless of stature or worldview, must purchase an annual license medallion. The disc weighed less than a walnut, yet its circumference would soon occupy more parchment than most border treaties. Records note that the inaugural tag bore a gently smiling hound whose ears resembled wilted tulips, an image selected after the town sculptor dreamed of soup spoons and decided the shape looked friendly. The chosen brass alloy, however, tarnished to the color of day-old custard within weeks, prompting a council addendum describing patina as an optional civic cloak. This wording soothed no one, but did produce the series' first microhook. A farmer named Durr wrote to complain. His terrier now resembled a knight wearing yesterday's coin. Collectors today, should they resist dozing off, might notice the stamp, Hull 1784, placed not at true north but a lazy 2 degrees west. Officials insisted this tilt reflected the principality's natural lean toward afternoon naps. When asked whether such symbolism might confuse neighboring duchies, the archivist yawned, recorded possibility of duchy disorientation, then dipped his quill in chamomile tea by mistake. He kept writing anyway, the pale ink drying into ghostly lines that future historians will painstakingly misinterpret. Within the first year, 213 tokens were sold, 18 to sheepdogs, 67 to lapdogs, and one, inexplicably, to a goat named Matilda, who barked convincingly in moonlight. Revenue barely covered the salary of the appointed dog tax receiver. Herr Kopp, whose duties included counting tokens, polishing his inkstand, and, on Fridays, verifying that no tags had spontaneously reproduced in cluttered drawers, to pass. The hours between such thrills, Kopp measured each disc's thickness with a feather, noting deviations smaller than a sneeze. His journals overflow with entries like token number 127 exhibits ambition of an extra hair's breadth. Perhaps intends to grow. Scholars have cited these lines as the purest expression of administrative affection ever to grace a pet-related tax dot by 1787. The council, hungry for funds yet wary of controversy, introduced color-coded tags. Brass remained for ordinary dogs. Copper signified proven rat catchers, a category hotly contested by dachshund owners who argued that intent mattered more than outcome. And a rare silver-wash tag denoted canine social ambassadors, a title bestowed upon exactly 2 animals, Princess Frederica's somnolent spaniel and the tavern keeper's mutt, who could allegedly nod in 3-time signatures. Engravers struggled to etch such nuanced honorifics in tiny lettering, so they adopted shorthand, PRC, CSA, and the delightfully ambiguous for dogs whose vocation defied bureaucracy. Herr Kopp's feather wept under the workload. Elsewhere, in the Principality, an enterprising blacksmith named Gertrude Pfeffer concocted a side business forging decorative frames to cradle the tokens, lest they jangle too brazenly at dawn. Her catalog offered velvet-lined copper ovals, taffeta crescents, and, for especially philosophical dogs, a circular frame festooned with question marks, symbolism for the existential mutt. Pfeffer's order book lists notes like one melancholic mastiff prefers mauve. Modern economists point to her venture as proof that regulation invariably breeds embellishment, but we may simply view it as a lullaby sung by supply and demand.r. Narration ambles into 1792, when an itinerant clockmaker from Württemberg arrived with pockets full of counterfeit tokens, each stamped 1793, a year in advance. He reasoned that selling the future at a discount might appeal to thrifty owners. Alas, his dog-shaped punches rendered the hound's snout too pointy. Herr Kopp instantly sensed mischief, or at least asymmetry. The trial lasted 3 afternoons, scheduled conveniently between communal bread rising and collective yawning. The accused was fined 5 genuine tokens and sentenced to mend the town's hourglass, which had been dribbling sand faster on humid days and thus unsettling the prayer bell, The affair produced only mild excitement, mostly regarding whether the dog on the counterfeit looked slightly more alert. Most agreed the sharper snout conveyed premature enthusiasm, never. Advisable in an economy paced by drowsy cobblers, legislation evolved at a pace best described as contemplative. A 1795 bylaw mandated holes pre-drilled at exactly 4 o'clock on each tag, ensuring uniform tilt when hung. The official circular explained that 4 o'clock invites twilight reflection. Compliance required re-stamping the entire stock. Apprentices spent a char-filled fortnight aligning punch and hammer. Folk songs later commemorated their rhythm tap, sigh though, all verses end mid-line, as though the singers wandered off for biscuits. Somewhere in an attic sits a half-finished lute ballad whose final chord was scheduled but never. Strumed, died around the turn of the century. Neighboring microstates took notice. Rittenberg briefly trialed hexagonal tokens to symbolize industrious honeycombs, but dogs recoiled at the extra corners knocking their chests. Not to be outdone, Waldenberg issued bone-shaped pewter tags coated in lavender wax against rust. They melted whenever a dog napped near the hearth, leaving fragrant puddles and paperwork. Tourists collected these mishaps in handkerchiefs, scenting their valises for weeks. Back in Helma, Langenberg, officials congratulated themselves on Brass's sleepy dependability. In Scene 3, our story pauses by a willow-shaded stream where herders gather every midsummer to renew licenses en masse. Herr Kopp, rheumatism now guiding his quill, sets up a trestle table laden with blank discs that glint like dull sunrise. Dogs cue politely. One must imagine the polite cued dogs, with owners whispering names to engravers who lightly mishear through birdsong. Thus Schnitzel becomes Schüssel. Brunhold, perhaps Bimmel, no correction is attempted. Everyone agrees the new spellings suit the season. Tokens clink into baskets, sounding faintly like distant wind chimes. Some listeners swear they can detect the chord of C major. Others insist it is simply the river applauding. Both interpretations are equally SOPORIFIC. Administration, being an endless stream seeking its own drizzly delta. 1804 brings the great ledger synchronization. Earlier volumes have listed tags by issue date, weight, owner surname, predicted dog mood, and occasional weather doodle. Queen Charlotte, visiting incognito, inquires whether such records might be unified. The proposal reels through committee for 9 rounds, ultimately adopting a 3-column format: dog, disc, and daydreams. The last column remains consistently blank, allowing space for future imagination. Archivists proudly stamp each page with a tiny cloud, signifying structured reverie. Researchers who leaf through the ledgers report sudden urges to nap upon the reading desk. Our final stretch coasts toward 1810, when brass shortages forced the mint to recycle obsolete. Church bells. New tokens carry faint echoes. When struck accidentally against a garden gate, they release a muffled ding, reminiscent of evening vespers. Farmers come to regard these sounds as gentle curfews, ushering them indoors before dew settles. One diary entry marvels that his spaniel chimed thrice at dusk, saving the cabbages from romantic frost. The council debates whether unintended liturgical resonance violates secular statutes. After a brief consultation with the bishop, who finds the notion charming, they agree to let the bells keep ringing wherever tails wagged at by 1813. Napoleon's shadow reaches the principality, but even imperial administrators deem dog taxes too modest to reform. The tokens survive regime changes, weather, and fashion. Herr Kopp retires, leaving behind 26 notebooks of diameter musings and a final entry. All circles eventually nap. His successor inherits the feather, though quills have become passe. He uses it anyway for tradition's sake, and because feather scratches help him stay awake during midwinter audits, Some rusty tokens persist today on farmhouse rafters, tied with twine among dried herbs. If you run a fingertip across their faded crowns, you might sense the slow heartbeat of provincial order, pulsing at 1 license per annum. Perhaps you'll imagine cop's feather trembling over fresh brass, or the hush of midsummer willow. Cues, or the silver ambassador spaniel sauntering through halls, tag gleaming like a modest comet. Let those images drift, unhurried, into your own evening. Consider each tag a tiny moon orbiting the great sleepy planet of history, reflecting enough pale light to guide you to the border of dreams, where ledger pages turn themselves and every dog, named or misspelled, curls quietly beside its softly chiming past. You might not expect a census devoted entirely to umbrella stands to last 16 years, but here we are. If by some miracle you're still alert when I reach the chapter on octagonal drip trays, feel free to subscribe or simply close your eyes and let the statistics wash over you like drizzle on polished brass. Our ramble begins in the mild, moth-scented spring of 1852, when the Oxford Municipal Board of Amenities received a politely urgent letter from Mr. Percival Nibbs, senior caretaker of the High Street Assembly Rooms. He reported that guests, upon arriving for evening lectures on the moral ambiguity of moss, had nowhere dignified to deposit their damp umbrellas. The resulting puddles, he wrote, formed accidental reflecting pools, in which serious scholars caught glimpses of their own socks, an intimacy considered risky for Victorian concentration. A subcommittee convened after tea resolved that the problem transcended individual vestibules and founded the Oxford Umbrella Stand Census, charged with cataloging every receptacle within city limits. They assumed the task would last a fortnight. It soon grew as calm and slow as creeping ivy. Enumerators 12 in the inaugural year were supplied with pocket ledgers, stitched from off-white linen, a 2-inch ruler, and a spool of blue ribbon for tagging stands whose provenance seemed uncertain. Each ledger page bore 4 headings: location, material, drip capacity milliliter, and aspirations. The last column, though never strictly defined, encouraged inspectors to record anything the stand appeared to long for fresh. Varnish, lighter burdens, perhaps a view of the quadrangle. Officials believed such imaginative notes would keep the enterprise gently humane, though most entries defaulted to undisclosed after inspectors tired of conjuring furniture feelings early. Findings meandered through the council minutes like a leisurely brook. There was the carved oak stand at St. Giles Bookbindery, whose scrollwork featured a fox reading a pamphlet about proper posture. Across town, the Rose and Crown boasted a repurposed sherry barrel lined with pewter droplets that chimed ever so lightly when raindrops dripped from folded silk parasols. One micro hook at precisely the 32nd page. An inspector noted that the barrel smells faintly of optimism and small courage. Elsewhere, a college porter proudly revealed a wrought iron rack so narrow it could accept only umbrellas of decisive slimness, disqualifying any owned by indecisive Donsdot by 1854. Auditors introduced the concept of puddling frequency. How? Often a stand required mopping. Measurements employed an eyedropper, a saucer, and patience. Volunteers counted droplets until they lost count, then estimated. The average stand reached saturation after 8.7 umbrellas, a figure quietly. Rounded to 9 for ease of bedtime arithmetic. You may feel eyelids drifting as you picture civil servants tallying puddles under gaslight, nibbling digestive biscuits so softly they hardly existed. A mild scandal, though scandalous only by umbrella stand standards, brewed when a clerk discovered. Duplicate entries for the same brass rack in 2 adjacent taverns. Investigation revealed that the landlord of the first tavern rolled the stand next door each Monday to lend an air of prosperity during market hours. The committee responded by attaching a tiny lead seal, a sleepy substitute for excitement. The clerk joked it would prevent migration. The others nodded, making a note to inventory the nods. Later. Another year, another ledger, 1856, introduced a color-coded index. Green ribbons indicated stands of academic origin, blue for ecclesiastical, red for any with wheels. Wheels, it turned out, delighted registrars. They hinted at motion but rarely delivered. The only wheeled specimen to venture beyond its assigned door was sighted clattering gently down Broad Street before settling, as though exhausted, against the wall of the Sheldonian Theater, sighing in cast iron. If you're still awake, you may wonder about outdoor stands. Those were assessed separately under the drizzly supervision of Miss Clara Wensleydale, whose speciality was timing how long an abandoned umbrella would remain upright in a gust. Her stopwatch, unreliable, added suspense to otherwise breath-like proceedings. She recorded that an elm root stand near Magdalen Bridge maintained equilibrium for 3 minutes and a polite second. Polite seconds became a unit. Conversion. Tables followed. 1 polite second equaled the span between noticing a stranger's hat askew and deciding not to mention it. The tables occupied 6 appendix pages, useful primarily for arithmetically inclined INSOM and IACS, dat by 1858. The census team counted 713 stands, or roughly 1 for every 3.4 citizens if one excluded infants and those resolutely carrying pocket umbrellas. Storage became a headache, not for the stands, mind you, but for the ledgers chronicling them. Shelves bowed like weary knees. Someone suggested condensing entries by removing the aspirations column. A vote passed narrowly 7-6, proving that bureaucracy, like a stubborn Raleigh, resists folding. A petite, drowsy uproar emerged over drip tray nomenclature. Should trays be called basins, saucers, or reservoirs? Minutes reveal a 4-hour discussion ending with the compromised term catchers. Even now, in some dusty corner of the Bodleian, you can find a parchment labeled Comprehensive Index of Catchers, 1859, annotated in sepia with notes such as tin-dented, dreamt of sky. The 1860 revision introduced stand morale. Surveys, a concept from continental psychologists who believed inanimate objects absorbed ambient mood. Enumerators were instructed to tap each stand lightly and rate the resulting resonance on a 5-yawn scale. Stands in lecture halls scored a predictable 3 yawns. Those in coffee houses bubbled at 1.5. A single stand at the public baths hummed so soothingly that the inspector, Mr. Lorimer, reportedly fell asleep against it, quill in hand, recording 4 yawns followed by a small ink blot interpretable as the elusive 5th dot in 1862 budget. Constraints required combining umbrella stand counts with lamppost inspections. Dual-purpose forms were printed. Confusion blossomed. One volunteer described a tall iron specimen with a flickering drip guard, only to realize he'd cataloged a gas lamp. Corrections were made in margins multiplied like twilight. Eventually, combined forms were abandoned, but not before producing the census's most charming error. Entry number 486 lists standard luminous puddle deterrent. Scholars debate whether it refers to a lamp with aspirations or a stand with delusions of grandeur. The penultimate burst of bureaucratic creativity arrived in 1865, when statistical clerk Edith Mallow invented the annual drizzle projection. She correlated rainfall averages with stand occupation rates, concluding that an additional 3 stands would be required each November to accommodate especially literary mists. Her graph, drawn in faint charcoal, rises so gently that some see only a sleepy horizon. Nonetheless, council members applauded, then requested tea. The projection, taped to a paneled wall, curled inward over years until it resembled a shy caterpillar dot by 1868. Civic interest slackened. Students preferred to sling umbrellas over arms. Newfangled Macintoshes rendered stands somewhat ceremonial. Funding dwindled to a trickle slower than condensation. On a Tuesday indistinguishable from any other, the committee voted to suspend. Further tallies until meteorological enthusiasm revives. They boxed the ledgers, tied them with the once blue ribbons, now the color of forgetting, and slid them beneath the town clerk's staircase, where echoing footsteps would lull. The pages for the next century dot today. A handful of those stands survive in vestibules you might wander past without a glance. One holds pamphlets about eco-cycling. Another props open a gallery door on summer days. Their drip catchers are dry, ambitions unrecorded. Yet, if you press a fingertip to the rim and close your eyes, perhaps you'll sense the faint thrum of polite seconds, the soft arithmetic of puddles counted by lamplight, and the quiet conviction that even the most forgettable corners of civic life deserve a census now and then. Let that hush settle around you like overcast afternoon. Let each unhurried datum guide your breathing slower, gentler, until umbrellas, stands, droplets, and ledgers mingle into one continuous, comforting drizzle of history falling softly, predictably just beyond the edge of waking. You might not expect the thickness of a provincial post office ink pad to alter the tempo of an entire town's correspondence, but here we are. If you're somehow still awake when I begin comparing crimson versus violet absorber felts, you're welcome to subscribe, or simply let your eyelids follow the slow settling of pigment and silence. Our journey drifts to the market town of Little Whittingford, where in the drowsy summer of 1891, Assistant Postmaster Horace Dabble proposed an audit of every ink pad on the premises. His reason was charmingly trivial. He believed uneven saturation caused clerks to blot letters more forcefully, resulting in a quiet chorus of sighs that unsettled the carrier pigeons roosting above the sorting room. A board supervisor signed the form, and thus began the great Little Whittingford inkpad ledger, an undertaking so unhurried that the first entry occurred 3 weeks later, after someone remembered to find paper. Enumerators 2 at first, then 3 were issued soft. Horsehair brushes, brass calipers of modest ambition, and a single candle stub for determining opacity by back glow. Each fresh pad received 5 observations: hue, squish factor, peripheral crust, mood, and ink scent after 10 minutes. Squish factor, measured and decisive yet delicate presses, occupied the inspectors for entire afternoons. Peripheral crust inspired philosophical musings about the inevitable stiffening of all things. The mood column, borrowed from a discontinued weather log, proved the most soothing. Early pads were labeled cooperative, later ones pensive, and one particularly flabby specimen simply resigned. Clerks soon added personal flourishes. Miss Gwendolyn T. Croft, whose handwriting resembled creeping ivy, appended a note that pad number 7 smelled faintly of burnt sugar and unrealized potential. Mr. Felix Sprout, less lyrical, wrote squishy in an apologetic way. These micro hooks, tucked between routine numbers, floated like light punctuation inside the ledger's long, languid sentences. By October, Dabble introduced the droplet-timed absorption method. A clerk would allow 1 precise droplet of regulation blue ink to fall from a glass rod, then count polite seconds until the surface stilled. Average absorption settled at 17.5 polite seconds, an interval just long enough to reflect on yesterday's oatmeal but not long enough to regret it. Someone crafted a conversion chart equating polite seconds to the distance a carrier pigeon might contemplate before changing direction. The table took an entire page and, like most tables, lulled readers into a velvet yawn dot. The first gentle scandal fluttered across blotting paper when pad number 12 showed a faint imprint of someone's spectacles, implying an inspector had leaned too closely in search of inspiration. Debate ensued. Should impressions count as previous usage, thereby downgrading the pad from pristine to pre-loved? Minutes record a consensus. Impressions made in pursuit of measurement were to be considered innocent echoes. Peace returned, and the pigeons, apparently untouched by the drama, carried on dozing. Winter crept in, and with it the issue of ink chill. Cold pigment flowed sluggishly, producing heavier stamps that bled through envelopes, tinting love letters. With unintended shadows. To combat this, a clerk warmed ink bottles near a radiator and recorded pad performance at 3 temperatures: brisk, agreeable, and positively toasty. Results differed by fractions no mind could fully cherish, yet the data were copied in copperplate for completeness. 1 figure 0.03 milliseconds, faster absorption at toasty earned a jaunty exclamation point, the only punctuation scandal in the entire volume. If you're still awake, you may appreciate the ledger's quiet foray into olfactory science. Early. 8092 solve a whiff test, wherein inspectors inhaled gently above each pad and noted scent journey. Top note, mid note, lingering soul. Pad number 18 offered hint of library dust, followed by distant marmalade. Pad number 22 gave merely Thursday. The experiment ended when someone sneezed upon the ledger margin, blurring squish factors into a plum-colored mist deemed artistic but impractical. By spring, pigeons molted and the post office ceiling looked momentarily snow-kissed. Dabble feared feathers might contaminate ink pads, prompting the feather adherence index. Random pin feathers dropped onto pad surfaces. Adherence percentages were logged in 0.5% increments. Most pads shrugged off the plumes with quiet dignity, though pad number 27 clung possessively, earning the affectionate nickname Magneto. A cartoon of Magneto, drawn in margins, depicts a pad cradling 6 cocoon-shaped quills, eyes closed in bliss. The doodle was never erased humor, like ink, stains gently but forever dot in 1893. A new supplier delivered pads lined with felt, dyed a jaunty heliotrope. The unexpected color shifted clerk's morning mood. Letters postmarked during this era bloom with floral purple smudges along the lower right corner's archivists call it the lavender epic. Data collectors revised the ledger headings to include chromatic cheer, a scale from 1 somber to 5 quietly exultant. Heliotrope pads averaged 4. One even reached an unprecedented 4.3, causing Dabble to declare a tea break and modest celebration. Microhooks flutter on. A postal trainee reported that tapping a pad thrice before stamping seemed to awaken a sweeter print. Another observed that whistling popular waltzes reduced over-inking. Such notes meander through the entries like distant music, occasionally repeating as if echoes sought reassurance. The ledger grew heavier, yet the tale remained light, a paradox inviting dreams. A brief flurry of innovation came with the dash test, where inspectors drew a small slash on scrap paper to note how far the ink spattered. Spatter lengths, measured in barleycorns, mapped out a constellation of accidental artistry. Pads ranked by gentleness formed a serene downward slope, like sheep descending a hill at dusk. The gentlest pad, number 41, produced spatter of exactly 1 barleycorn, praised as barely a breath. Its page still radiates hush. Midway through 1894, the town installed a new telegraph line, and message volume swelled. Clerks hurried visibly for the first time. Ink pads faced the stress of consecutive impressions. Fatigue statistics were introduced. Impressions before fading, recovery intervals, audible sighs from users. The ledger notes that after 32, stamps without pause, pad number 46 whimpered in a manner perceptible only to those already tired. Readers encountering this line often paused to test their own fatigue, then continued. Slower dot budget whispers soon drifted in, suggesting consolidation. Perhaps one pad per desk instead of two, or communal saturation basins. Dabble, protective, drafted a 16-point rebuttal citing the psychological comfort of abundance. Point 7 reads, an idle pad reassures the hand. After a mild stalemate, management compromised by purchasing narrower blotting sheets. Instead, sparing the pads but shrinking the world of smudges. One final flourish of paperwork emerged. The courier compliment log. Whenever a mail carrier praised clarity of cancellation marks on their route, the responsible pad earned a gold asterisk in the ledger margin. Over 8 months, only 3 asterisks appeared. Yet clerks spoke of them in hushed tones, as though the stars might grant wishes at closing time. Pad number 49 earned 2 of the 3, then wore out the next week, achieving, in its quiet way, a meteor's arc dot by 1895. The ledger's ivory pages thickened the air with the smell of subdued berries and old cabinets. New management considered the audit complete, statistics ample, conclusions placid. The final entry is dated a Tuesday, blurred by drizzle. It reads, pad number 52, gray-blue, squish agreeable, aspirations unrecorded, followed by a line drawn faintly as if the quill itself were dozing. The inkpad ledger was bundled with twine, slipped onto a shelf above surplus twine, and largely forgotten. Yet every so often a visiting archivist opens it, breathes in heliotrope ghosts, and feels hushed settle like evening dust. If you lean close, you might hear pigeons coo above the sorting room, the plink of a droplet falling, the near imperceptible. Patience of a pad waiting to be pressed just once more. Let that notion cradle you now, the idea that somewhere pigment waits unhurried inside felt. That measurements of squish in polite seconds remain unhurriedly true, and that even the faintest mark on an envelope mattered to someone's bedtime arithmetic. Allow those small, soothing facts to linger like lavender on parchment, slowing each breath, softening the edges of thought, until numbers, feathers, and heliotrope hues merge into one continuous, comforting blot of history expanding gently, quietly, just beyond the lamp-lit edge of awareness. You may not imagine that the precise length of a humble library bookmark could stir months of gently bewildered debate across 3 counties, but here we are. If by the time I reach the section on ribbon fray coefficients you find yourself still conscious, feel free to subscribe though, honestly. Drifting off mid-sentence is the greater compliment. Our scene settles over the regional consortium of quiet reading rooms. Year 1904, when Mr. Percival Twinge, assistant clerk for loose inserts and minor ephemera, noticed something mildly irksome. Bookmarks, he wrote, arrived of incompatible stature, ranging from the stately 5-inch cardstock supplied by Westbridge, printing to the jaunty 3 1/4-inch ribbons donated by admirers of verse. Patrons, forced either to tilt bookmarks diagonally or allow decorative tassels to dangle, produced a soft rustling that unsettled senior readers during their post-lunch doze. Twinge proposed a standard length. The proposal was received with the collective shrug of people pleased to have a new lullaby. A committee convened. Its charter 12 pages of unhurried penmanship defined 3 deliverables. Measure existing bookmarks, tabulate reader size attributable to overhang, and select an official length supportive of nap-friendly silence. They began by borrowing 2 folding rulers, 1 reluctant tape measure, and a magnifying glass meant for map inspection but eager for new horizons. Volunteers gathered a representative sample, 147 bookmarks of paper, ribbon, silk, straw, and, perplexingly, 1 from compressed beet pulp. Each was placed upon a felt mat, its dimensions whispered aloud as though reading bedtime stories to board furniture. Catalogers recorded not only length, but personality of edge square, scalloped, fuzzed, or self-doubtful. They noted ink aromas, hints of licorice, vague kettle steam, and relative willingness to stay inside a book once the cover's shut. One micro hook emerges here, bookmark number 29. A missionary leaflet exhibited a strange habit of migrating 2 chapters forward overnight. The committee labeled it ambitious. Data accumulated like slow snowfall. Spreadsheets of faint graphite figures spilled across desks, and at 3 p.m. each day, Mr. Twinge led the gentle summation, reading numbers aloud in drifting cadence. 4 inches point 1, passled. 4 inches point 3, restrained. 4 inches point 2, slightly philosophical. Listeners reported a pleasant dizziness, as though rocked by shallow waves. Early spring introduced controlled reader trials. Quiet volunteers were given identical novels in different bookmarks, then observed through half-closed doors. Librarian Miss Eveline Wisp tallied audible page, placed confirmations, smalls, and satisfactory nods, while Mr. Gramley Quirk measured bookmark flutter amplitude. When the windows were cracked exactly 2 fingers width, after 57 gentle experiments, the data showed a negligible but undeniably existent lull in reader movement when bookmarks measured precisely 4 inches and 7/16. Still, dissent arrived like a sigh. Mrs. Dorothea Plum, champion of shorter ribbons, argued that extra length wasted ink in the manufacturing of decorative Latin mottos no one finished reading. She submitted a counter-proposal on lavender stationery, smelling faintly of old cake, suggesting a trim 3 5/8. This triggered the great frugal margin deliberation, a week of polite murmurs during which committee members compared the meditative pleasure of a long motto to the thrifty thrill of a short one. Meeting minutes record 18 uses of the word outside. Rain thickened. Inside, compromise brewed. They adopted the bend test. Insert bookmark, close volume, tip book 15 degrees, observe protrusion droop. Longer bookmarks, though comical in languor, created no disturbance in airflow, whereas 2 short specimens disappeared altogether, leaving patrons to re-thumb pages with the gentle exasperation of someone losing yarn between cushions. Ultimately, the committee settled into what they called the sleepy middle, 4 inches and 1/2, plus or minus the thickness of a patient sigh. While printers readied prototypes, Mr. Twinge devised the edge soften index. Volunteers stroked bookmark corners against the tender skin inside their wrists, reading any sharpness on a scale from cloud to Z. Several observers nearly nodded off mid-stroke, prompting a footnote that the method itself had supplementary soporific benefit. Production trials yielded cardstock and muted oatmeal, sage, and late afternoon gray. Colors were tested for visual intrusion. Samples were inserted at random into shelves. Then staff ambled by, rating the chance of noticing. Oatmeal scored. Lois described as utterly unstartling. Sage, unexpectedly lively in sunlight, was downgraded to quietly acceptable only in windowless alcoves. Thus oatmeal advanced to final consideration, earning a celebratory pot of chamomile. Even then, further microhooks fluttered in. Someone questioned whether numerical positions printed on bookmarks, in case readers wished to log page progress, might spark competition, disturbing serenity. A subcommittee on competitive tendencies convened for exactly 1 meeting before concluding that numbers in pale ink would invite reflection rather than rivalry. Page markers printed from 25 to 400. At dreamy intervals of 37 pages were approved, because 37 felt leisurely. At last came the inaugural distribution day. Boxes labeled OCSBL41, official consortium standard bookmark length, were wheeled into the reading rooms. Patrons accepted them with wordless interest, slipping oatmeal slips between chapters, like feathers into waiting pillows. Observers stood back, counting nothing but the absence of counting. No sighs, no flutter, no restless repositioning. Evening fell, lamps glowed, and a hush, even softer than usual, roam the aisles. Yet the story decides not to finish an intentional choice. For nothing spoils drowsy history like decisive endings. The committee never disbanded. It simply forgot. To meet again, minutes drifting into gaps between other minutes. Leftover sage prototypes were repurposed as test strips for ink pad absorbency, a nod to previous inquiries you may recall. While the single beat pulp bookmark lives on in a tin labeled Misc Curiosities Do Not Dust. If you wander the archives today, you might spot Mr. Twinge's original ruler, folded at the sleepy middle mark, content to remain half open forever. And so we linger among oatmeal tones and 4-inch halves, where page corners meet their placid match, and mottos end before they've truly started. Allow the notion of perfect, unremarkable length to unspool in your mind, like a ribbon promising nothing more than staying put. Let numbers blur into the grain of quiet cardstock. Let tassels hang without ambition. Let every buck you haven't. Finish find its pause exactly where your breathing slows. Then drift, perhaps, to that committee chamber where destinies of bookmarks napped upon felt, and where even a ruling declared in full sincerity could be mistaken for someone talking. In their sleep. You may be surprised to learn there was once an official committee devoted to the tilt of public library reading lamps. Yet here we are, back in 1927, when a small congregation of lighting enthusiasts believed the angle between bulb and page could prolong both eyesight and drowsiness in equal measure. If you're still blinking by the time we get to tungsten filament wattage audits, you're welcome to subscribe, but only if the effort doesn't wake you up. It all began in the low-ceilinged reference hall, the Milford Borough Library, whose hanging lamps cast such direct glare that patrons complained of accidental alertness. Enter Mr. Lionel Softwick, assistant custodian of Ladder's Dust, and incidentals who propose the Angle of Repose initiative. Every lamp should lean forward just far enough to illuminate print without startling pupils. He calculated on papery. Scraps torn from the returned late ledger that a pitch of precisely 12 degrees and a half produced the gentlest luminance. His numbers, rechecked at tea breaks, wandered between 11-ish and 13-ish, but never enough to disturb. The afternoon hush-dotted task force was formed. Its charter contained 3 ambitions: catalog existing lamp tilts, time how long readers doze beneath each, and recommend a nod supportive standard. Members included Mrs. Prue Wimbrell, who possessed a protractor shaped like a smiling owl, Mr. Bixley Drum, who once slept through an entire census, and Miss Marigold Spruce, whose handwriting resembled moonlit grass. They surveyed 84 lamps, noting angle, bulb warmth, cord tension, and the faint aroma of aged metal. One micro hook fluttered up. Lamp 14 smelled vaguely of cocoa, though no one recalled chocolate within 50 yards. Measurements were performed with theatrical quiet. Mrs. Wimbrell would kneel, align her L protractor against the lamp stem, then whisper 12.3, as though announcing an especially shy species of moth. Mr. Drum stood behind, timing blinks among nearby readers and recording nod velocity, the gentle bob of a chin toward collarbone. Miss Spruce, meanwhile, traced the lamp's silhouettes onto tracing paper, labeling each serene, nearly serene, or ambitiously bright. Findings revealed a low sweet spot between 11.9 and 12.7 degrees. Wider tilts caused textual shadows. Narrower produced what the minutes called eyelid tension. Seeking confirmation, they embarked on the evening glow trials. Volunteers received identical anthologies of railway timetables chosen for their rhythmic page numbers and were seated under lamps adjusted to varying pitches. Observers tallied yawns per quarter hour. The 12-degree lamps averaged 5.4 yawns, while any within a degree of that figure hovered agreeably around 6. Lamps under 10 degrees plummeted to 3 scions, and unacceptably alert. Statistic dot, yet dissent bloomed. Mr. Horace Nettle, representing the National Guild of Upright Fixtures, argued that tilting fixtures endangered bulbs by exposing filaments to gravity anxiety. He provided a diagram of a nervously trembling filament, which, despite its comic charm, earned 2 pages of polite rebuttal. The committee responded with a quiet pendulum experiment, suspending a lit bulb at assorted angles inside a glass. Case they observed that filaments, unbothered by gravity or charts, glowed on with indifference. A footnote records Mr. Nettle's concession delivered in a tone approaching nap. The task force next confronted color temperature. Early lamps varied from frosty white to seaside amber. Tests showed that pages under amber light mimicked late summer dusk, causing readers to rub their eyes in nostalgic languor ideal. Cold white, by contrast, triggered faint desk tapping and occasional pencil sharpening, both audible crimes against slumber. Thus, the amber affirmation was drafted. Bulbs must hum at 2,600 Kelvin, plus or minus the warmth of a fond memory. Procurement officers, mildly puzzled by such units, nonetheless source crates labeled Cozy Glow Handle sleepily. A brief, tangent hour scheduled microhook arrives, courtesy of Lamp 42, whose shade bore a tiny puncture shaped exactly like Finland. Sunbeams through that hole projected a Nordic silhouette onto page margins at 3:17 p.m. each day, prompting 2 separate patrons to add expedition notes to their grocery lists. The committee, charmed, left the hole untouched, calling it cartographic. Whimsy. By midsummer, the data of drowsiness had grown into scrolls of nearly illegible pencil. Mr. Drum compiled them into the Grand Oscillation Table, charting tilt against yawn pitch, page turn rate, and duration of accidental naps. Lines curved like gentle river bends, all converging around that magic 12-degree shore. The committee scheduled a public demonstration. Chairs were arranged in concentric semicircles, lamps lowered to the recommended angle, and townsfolk, invited to read pamphlets on municipal sewage widely appreciated for their tranquilizing prose. Within 11 minutes, observers reported a chorus of soft breathing. A success, or so they would have proclaimed had they themselves not nodded off to the soothing hum of distant plumbing diagrams. Final adoption required only one more hurdle: cord length optimization. Over short cords made lamps hover irritably. Overhead, too long, and shades brushed spectacles during page turns, creating static crackles. Experiments determined an optimal drop of 23 inches from ceiling to shade rim, measured on an ordinary umbrella handle because tape measures had migrated to the bookmark subcommittee storeroom next door. It worked elegantly when an umbrella can double as a ruler. You know, the pace is sufficiently unhurried. Printing of guidelines commenced. The pamphlet bore the title, Angle, Lumen, Slumber, a considered approach, set in a typeface so rounded that the dot above each. I resembled a tiny pillow. Distribution day felt more like a slow parade. Boxes slid rather than thumped. Librarians wore cardigans of extra soft knit to mute sleeve sounds. And Mr. Softwick himself sprinkled the aisle carpets with experimental hush granules, actually. Coarse flour, which left gentle footprints, and an aroma of faint bakeries dot here. Another micro-hook emerges. To celebrate, Miss Spruce devised the lamp angle lullaby, 5 notes ascending, then sagging back down, which she hummed whenever someone installed a fixture at the sanctioned pitch. Rumor claims that tune still haunts the ventilation ducts on especially drowsy Thursdays. Rollout produced fewer incidents than the committee predicted. One lamp in the children's corner, accidentally set to 13 degrees, led to spirited storybook recitations instead of the intended hush. Corrected to 12, the children discovered the joy of reading silently while plotting imaginary expeditions. Beyond the shelf, Across the adult stacks, midday nappers reported dreams, vaguely illuminated but unremarkably eventful, which the task force logged as desirable, and so the angle of repose quietly took root, spreading via interlibrary loan to distant towns where committees re-verified the data simply for the pleasure of repeating the measurements. Over years, bulbs changed from tungsten to compact fluorescent to LED, yet custodians kept a discreet wedge at the hinge to maintain the ancestral tilt. Even the owl protractor, now framed in a corridor, rests forever at 12 and a smidge. Its painted feathers fading to oatmeal dot, there is, reassuringly, no rousing finale. The lamps still lean obligingly, the amber still glows. The grand oscillation table gathers settled dust, so even its grid lines look comfortably reclined. If you happen to open an old volume in Wildford tonight, watch how the light drifts across. The page at that benign angle, coaxing letters into soft focus until paragraph edges blur and meaning loosens like shoelaces before bed. Allow the tilt to guide your own eyelids downward, the gentle arithmetic of 12 degrees translating into one drowsy silence. Somewhere in archival shadows, Mr. Softwick's umbrella hangs precisely 23 inches above the floor, marking the spot where long ago argument surrendered to yawned consensus. Let its quiet geometry accompany you until numbers sink beneath lamplight and you, comfortably angled, pause mid-story and drift. You might not expect the quiet destiny of an entire breakfast table to hinge upon the shape pressed into a pat of butter. Yet in the 1880s, a small league of Victorian boarding house matrons devoted 3 calm decades to refining stamps that would leave neither ripple nor doubt upon the dairy surface. If you remain faintly conscious by the time we reach the controversy over scalloped edges versus fluted suns, feel free to subscribe, though only if your finger can find the button without disturbing the blankets. The story drifts in on a tide. Of cream, Mrs. Clementina Hatch, proprietor of Hatch's Temperate Lodgings in Cheltenham, believed that guests who lingered over buttered toast were less inclined to complain about drafts. She purchased a wooden stamp carved with a modest sheaf of wheat, pressed it gently into each chilled pat, and observed through half-closed eyes that conversation at breakfast, slowed by a measurable 3 syllables per sentence, encouraged. She wrote a letter to Ladies' Companion magazine suggesting that tasteful impressions upon butter conduce to moral repose. Thus began the Society for Sedate Dairy Embellishment. Its inaugural meeting convened in the back parlor of Mrs. Hatch's boarding house on an Ogden. October afternoon so bland that even the mantel clock seemed unsure whether to tick. 7 matrons attended, each accompanied by a tin of homemade pats and a favorite stamp wrapped in mufflers to prevent chipping. The tools ranged from a simple thistle to an ambitious scene of St. Paul's Cathedral, complete with pigeons. They brewed tea that smelled faintly of timidity, and passed the pats around in silence, admiring how a soft sheen caught the grooves. Minutes of that unhurried session note 3 earnest aims: to catalog existing butter stamp motifs, to establish guidelines for soothing impression depth, and to encourage the domestic carvers of Britain to pursue gentler designs. They resolved to publish an annual catalog of tranquil butter reliefs. The first edition, printed in ink the color of weak cocoa, listed 39 patterns. Each entry included a sensory footnote such as encourages meditative chewing, or invites an extra moment of spreading, thereby delaying the day. Micro hook number 1 slips in here. Pattern No. 12, titled The Thoughtful Turnip, depicted a root vegetable gazing at its own leaves. Critics called it whimsical. Supporters argued it reminded diners that even produce contemplates its destiny. The stamp sold out within months, prompting a minor scandal when counterfeit turnips, slightly more chipper in expression, appeared on the market. A quiet lawsuit ensued. Court transcripts reveal the judge paused proceedings twice to butter. Scones, perhaps testing exhibit evidence. By 1891, the Society's membership had spread to Bath, York, and the outskirts of Dundee. Regional chapters met quarterly, each gathering preceded by the hush of parcel post boxes arriving with fresh stamp prototypes. Mrs. Dorcas. Smallgood of Bath championed an oval design showing a sleeping owl. Night creatures, she explained, and her circular, confer vicarious drowsiness upon morning victuals. Meanwhile, in York, Miss Hester Prime perfected the feathered ripple, a pattern carved so shallowly that it dissolved halfway through spreading, leaving only a suspicion of design and effect celebrated as subconscious ornament. Standards evolved. The Guide to Impression Depth recommended that grooves not exceed 1/16 of an inch, lest toast acquire ridges fierce enough to fluster marmalade. Butter should be chilled to the firmness of a polite handshake, stamped with a single decisive. Press, then allowed precisely 4 minutes of repose, so the edges might soften into suggestion rather than statement. Observance of these rules, inspectors claimed, lowered incidence of knife clatter by 8%. A light tangential fact drifts past. One enterprising innkeeper in Leeds affixed minuscule labels beneath her butter close reading, "Please proceed." Without haste. Guests reportedly complied, buttering in slow arcs reminiscent of pendulums. Revenue from extended tea service rose modestly, a statistic forwarded to the Society as proof that serenity could, in polite amounts, be monetic. But comfort rarely proceeds unopposed. The Association for Brisk Domestic Efficiency, headed by brisk persons who preferred square pats, stacked like playing cards, published a pamphlet titled Butter Imprints. Frivolity on the table. They warned that lingering over dairy invited rumination unbecoming of a progressive household. The sedate stampers replied with a measured 3-page rejoinder printed in pale gray, arguing that contemplation was, in fact, a virtue and that hurried consumption produced indigestion, hiccups, and regrettable remarks to settle matters. A comparative breakfast was staged in Harrogate. 2 identical dining rooms, separated by a velvet curtain, received parties of unsuspecting travelers. Room A served unadorned butter rectangles. Room B offered pats bearing the Society's newly favored motif, quiet brook. Observers timed meals with discreet hourglasses the size of gooseberries. Results showed Room B diners remained seated 7 minutes longer, sipped tea at half the velocity, and left 2/3 fewer crumbs. The curtain parted to reveal these figures on placards, so understated they almost apologized for existing. Debate subsided into a murmur onto chemistry. Professor Mildred Lax of King's College tested whether impression depth affected melting rate. She concluded that shallow grooves increased surface area just enough to hasten the gentle surrender of butter onto toast, thereby reducing impatience, a finding celebrated in the Society newsletter under the headline, "Physics Bows to Decorum." Her lab assistants commemorated the discovery by carving a stamp of a melting hourglass. Only 6 were ever made, their whereabouts now a sleepy mystery. Another microhook glides in, the unintentional hedgehog pattern. A carver in Norfolk slipped while chiseling and produced a vaguely bristled blob. Shipped by error to a boarding school, it became beloved by pupils who claimed the hedgehog encouraged them to spread butter in cautious, affectionate strokes. The Society, initially horrified, relented and listed it in the catalog's novelty appendix with the disclaimer, "Best applied before the second bell." As the 20th century yawned into view, electric refrigerators promised firmer butter, and factories began pressing pats by machine with austere ridges. Membership dipped. To revitalize interest, Mrs. Hatch's granddaughter, Mabel, proposed an exhibition of historical butter stamps at the Crystal Palace Tea Rooms, 20 glass. Cases displayed lineage from Wheat Sheaf to Whispering Wave. Visitors moved slowly, as though tread carpets of syrup. Reports say that one elderly gentleman fell asleep mid-stride, his cane resting against a case labeled Moonlit Potato Pattern Now Lost. During the exhibition, a newly commissioned design stole the whispering spotlight. Sailing cloud, its curves were so faint that, when the butter melted, a delicate swirl appeared upon the plate like vapor escaping a teacup. Admirers described the effect as almost remembering a dream. Orders arrived from as far as Antwerp, where a restful cafe served it on rye beneath the sign Quiet Bread, Quieter Butter. Even the post-impressionists took note. Painter Algernon Wisp attended, sketched a dozen stamps, and later produced canvases featuring oversized butter pots adrift in sepia skies. Critics dismissed them as culinary lullabies, which he considered a triumph. Two of these gentle paintings still hang in a gallery corridor few patrons bother to enter. A guard there reportedly chooses the early shift because nothing ever happens after noon dot, yet progress crept forward, self-sold. Wartime rationing curtailed dairy frivolities. Wooden stamps were shelved, sometimes burnt for kindling. After peace returned, margarine arrived in oblong blocks that resisted polite impression. The Society's minutes grow brief, then blank. Final entry dated in careful ink simply reads, "May our patterns wait in the cool shade until better days." The ledger closes without haste. Still, traces endure. In certain antique shops, you may find a lilac-lined box marked "Breakfast Companions." Inside, beneath tissue brittle as old snowfall, lies a stamp the owl, perhaps, or the brook it screws, faintly smelling of bygone dairies. Should you press it into fresh, unsalted butter, the design will linger only moments before dissolving into spreadable quiet. That fleeting impression, like the soft indentation your head leaves on a pillow, is the Society's last surviving manifesto, beauty brief enough to encourage slowing down. So, if tomorrow's morning finds you near a loaf, a knife, and a willingness to dawdle, chill your butter just so, steady your stamp, and press. Observe the pattern. Let it suggest an extra breath. Spread gently, tasting how patience feels on the tongue. And when the toast is gone and only a shallow swirl of creaminess remains, allow yourself a moment more, for there is no bell, only the hush between heartbeats where the thoughtful turnip. Once pondered its leaves, leave the dish unwashed for a few minutes. The fading grooves are harmless. They will blur into nothing much, like footprints in soft sand awaiting the tide. Step away slowly. Somewhere, perhaps, a mantel clock wonders whether to tick, and an old ledger dreams of new entries it no longer needs to record. Let them all rest. Let the morning stretch, unmeasured, until even time decides to butter its own toast and drift back to bed. You might not suspect that the sleepy fate of seaside postcards once hinged on the official hue of the iron pillar boxes standing along Britain's quieter promenades. Yet beginning in 1893, an earnest subcommittee of the General Post Office devoted 5 unhurried years to defining exactly which shade of red would lull the eye without alarming the hand that posted a letter. If you're still propped upright by the time we compare vermilion to carmine for the 7th time, feel free to subscribe, though only if that motion can be performed without creasing your pillow. The first gentle ripple originated in Clacton-on-Sea, where holidaymakers complained that freshly painted boxes glared like miniature sunsets. Jolting afternoon strollers awake, Mr. Neville Turn, a junior inspector, whose mustache was reputedly more decisive than he, proposed a consultation on chromatic softness. His circular observed, in sentences that practically yawned, that a subtler tincture might soothe the posting public, encourage reflective correspondence, and promote the considerate delay of outgoing mail. The memorandum drifted through the postal hierarchy like seaweed, eventually beaching itself upon a desk labeled Miscellaneous Comforts. Thus formed the Advisory Board on Pillar Box Tranquility. Its members included Miss Euphemia Quill, keeper of pigment ledgers, Mr. Wycliffe Drowse, who could nap standing, and Mrs. Lettuce Shore, famed for identifying 14 distinct moods, of coral. Their charter outlined 3 duties: collect every red known to domestic manufactories, observe each at dawn, midday, and dusk, and record any resulting size among pedestrians. They began by requesting paint samples thickly dabbed onto cardboard squares the size of playing cards. The first delivery, 37 tones from pinkish promise to sanguine ember, arrived in a crate that smelled indulgently of turpentine and patience. Each morning at 6:30, a time chosen because gulls had not yet practiced their louder cries, the trio pinned cards to a roped railing along the pier. They would stare, unblinking, for exactly 9 minutes, gauging which red encouraged eyelids to drift. Mr. Drowse, ever empirical, rated his own urge to yawn on a scale of 1 to 5. Miss Quill noted whether passers-by slowed their footsteps. Mrs. Shore added gentle marginalia such as suggests faded jam or evokes last ember of picnic fire. The calmest tint during week 1 bore the poetic factory label, number 17B. By fortnight's end, the record book contained such observations as Carmen 14 invites a reflective shuffle, and Scarlet 22 inspires decisive envelope. Stuffing too sprightly. Seeking broader data, they toured other coastal towns, carting their paint cards in soft-lined valises so as not to disturb the chips. In Bournemouth, a retired lighthouse keeper opined that brick rows matched the somnolent glow of fog lamps, viewed through half-closed lashes high praise. In Scarborough, however, the fishing fleet preferred deeper oxide crimson, arguing that anything paler resembled undercooked lobster. The committee, ever polite, jotted these views while maintaining an unimpressed drowse. A micro-hook surfaces here. While lodging above a tea shop in Whitby, Mrs. Shore discovered an 1870s pillar box that salty winds had dulled to what she christened drifted russet. Locals had grown so accustomed to its sleepy tone that any repainting, they warned, could provoke unnecessary punctuality. She dutifully scraped a discreet fragment permission, granted in exchange for a fruit scoon, and slipped it into her notebook as reference sample L. Back in London, experiments shifted indoors. Box's miniature test cylinders cast in plaster were coated in finalist shades and placed in the dimness chamber, a softly lit basement where volunteers posted blank postcards addressed to the future. An observer hidden behind potted palms timed how long each participant lingered after sliding the card through the slot. Longer reveries indicated superior tranquility. Drifted russet scored an impressive 12-second post-moment, while sanguine ember produced a hasty 4, accompanied by an audible clearing of throat certainly too alert, yet bureaucracy enjoys a detour. The board received a pamphlet from the National Society for Visual Pep, warning that overly muted colors might diminish civic pride. Its cover displayed a caricature pillar box dozing beneath an umbrella, mail spilling languorously onto the pavement. Amused, the committee responded with a 30-page appendix demonstrating that mail volume in Drislington-on-Sea, whose boxes had accidentally weathered to a dusky blush, exceeded seaside averages by 7% proof. They claimed that calm tones foster thoughtful correspondence. Into this tranquil tug-of-hue stepped chemistry. Professor Aloysius Silt of the Royal College analyzed the pigment bases, concluding that high barium content produced a subtle matte finish, which softened glare beneath gas lamps. He provided vials of barium rose, advising 2 coats and a fortnight's. Cure in moist air for optimal languor. Trials commenced immediately. The plaster cylinders were recoated and left in a steamy conservatory among ferns. Observers reported that dew collected on their surfaces like perspiring dreams. Our next micro-hook arrives via pigeon post. A message tied to the leg of a particularly indifferent bird announced that on Guernsey, A village blacksmith had mixed red oxide with crushed seashell, yielding a shade called whispering coral. The committee ordered a sample. When applied, it appeared almost bashful, as though the box regretted intruding upon the promenade. Miss Quill confessed it reminded her of reading sentimental novels by lamplight, eyelids drooping after every chapter. Whispering Coral advanced. To the final round, dot by year 4, minutes chronicled 96 meetings, each punctuated by prolonged contemplative silences mistaken for adjournments. Funding, though modest, covered endless cups of tepid tea and the purchase of a lux meter to measure reflected gloom. Data arcs spiraled inevitably toward 3 finalists: Drifted Russet, Barium Rose, and Whispering Coral. A public referendum was scheduled in Worthing. 3 full-size boxes, freshly painted, were bolted to a quiet stretch of seafront. Citizens received colored marbles ivory for preference, slate for mild aversion to drop into glass cylinders beside each box. By sundown, the Drifted Russet cylinder contained 243 ivory spheres and an apologetic note reading, "Forgive my sleepiness." Marble misplaced. Victory appeared certain until a summer squall salted the boxes overnight, slightly bleaching Whispering Coral into a nuance later defined as hesitant salmon. Morning walkers adored the accidental tint, describing it as sunrise seen through curtains. Faced with a tie complicated by meteorology, the board convened an extraordinary contemplation session. After 3 hours of communal looking into the middle distance, they adopted an elegantly circuitous compromise, a 2-layer method in which Drifted Russet served as base coat, gently visible through a translucent glaze of Whispering Coral. This fusion would, they believed, age gracefully. Toward hesitant salmon, achieving peak tranquility within approximately 12 seaside winters, implementation rolled out at the pace of coastal erosion. Existing boxes were subtly sanded by postmen instructed to hum lullabies to avoid alarming pedestrians. Painters applied the recipe with broad, unhurried strokes, pausing often to let gulls critique their work with non-committal squawks. In diaries later archived, one painter wrote that the color seemed part memory, part sunset, and that more than once he forgot whether he had finished a panel. So seamless was the tone against late afternoon clouds. A final audit conducted exactly 1 year after completion noted fewer hurried footsteps near post boxes, an uptick in leisurely sealed envelopes, and a mild renaissance of seaside poetry, often scrawled on the backs of fish and chip menus, then mailed inland. Mr. Drowse, retired but honorary consultant, observed these improvements from a deck chair, dutifully marking non-frequency in the margins of the local paper until his pencil slid between pages and he dozed, the very embodiment of postal placidity. Today, many of those boxes remain, their dual-layer red mellowed to something neither catalog nor rainbow precisely names. If you encounter one, tilt your head a respectful 12 degrees, regard its surface as the committee once did, and feel your thoughts drift like postcards unhurried toward the morning collection. Drop a letter if you wish, but linger afterward. Count to 12. Watch how the color becomes softer with each heartbeat, until even the written word in your pocket feels ready to close its eyes. And when you step away, let the hush of distant breakers accompany you, the faint smell of salt and paint mingling into the kind of memory that never rushes the tongue. Somewhere in a forgotten drawer, a single ivory marble still testifies that drifted hues once mattered. Enough to measure. It rests there quietly, no conclusion, no last-minute urgency, just the gentle conviction that even a pillar box may prefer to whisper rather than shout, and that the most comforting red is the one content to fade, slowly, with you.